Richard Hawthorne had spent 30 years building an empire that everyone admired, but no one truly loved. As the founder and CEO of Hawthorne Global Industries, he was known as a man who never accepted excuses. Newspapers called him the Iron CEO. Business magazines praised his ruthless decision-making. Investors celebrated him as a visionary. But inside the towering glass headquarters bearing his name, employees whispered a different story. Richard demanded perfection. A single mistake could end a career. Missed deadlines meant immediate termination. Competitors who challenged him rarely survived in business for long. He negotiated billion-dollar deals without showing a hint of emotion, and every victory only made him colder. People respected him. Few actually liked him. To Richard, emotions were distractions, friendships were liabilities, and kindness was simply bad business. His company grew into one of the largest corporations in America. He owned private jets, luxury penthouses across 3 countries, exotic cars worth millions, and a mansion so enormous that tourists often mistook it for a museum. From the outside, Richard Hawthorne had everything. But life has a strange way of reminding people that money cannot buy control. It happened on a rainy November evening. Richard had just finished a late-night board meeting and was being driven home through the city. Rain hammered against the limousine windows while lightning flashed across the skyline. His assistant sat across from him, reviewing documents for the next day's acquisition. Richard barely looked up. "Move tomorrow's meeting to 8, he said while signing another contract. "Yes, sir." Moments later, everything changed. A speeding truck ignored a red light. The impact was violent. Steel twisted. Glass exploded. The limousine spun across the intersection before crashing into a concrete barrier. Silence. When Richard finally opened his eyes, he couldn't move. Not his arms, not his legs, not even his fingers. Only his eyes. Doctors fought for nearly 12 hours to save his life. Against all odds, they succeeded. But the damage to his spinal cord was irreversible. Richard Hawthorne, the billionaire who once controlled thousands of employees with a single phone call, would never walk again. The diagnosis devastated the business world. Financial news covered the accident around the clock. Stock prices fluctuated. Executives questioned the company's future. Employees wondered if the legendary CEO would ever return. Weeks later, Richard was discharged from the hospital. His sprawling mansion had been transformed into a private medical residence. One entire wing now resembled a luxury hospital. Advanced monitoring systems lined the walls. Specialized equipment filled every room. Physical therapists visited daily. Nurses worked around the clock, the best medical care money could buy. Yet every morning looked exactly the same. Richard stared silently through the massive bedroom windows while the sun climbed into the sky. The man who once held endless meetings now spent hours listening to the ticking of a clock. His phone stopped ringing. Business partners visited less often. Friends became strangers. Even family members found reasons not to stay long. Loneliness settled over the mansion like a heavy fog. Then another problem began: the caregivers. The first caregiver lasted 12 days. She resigned without explanation. The second stayed only a week. The third quit after 4 days. Then came the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. One after another, they all walked away. The agency increased salaries. Nothing changed. They doubled the pay. Still, nobody stayed. Some caregivers claimed Richard insulted them constantly. Others said he screamed over the smallest mistakes. One admitted she cried in her car every night before work. Another simply said, "I've never met someone so determined to push every person away." The resignations became so frequent that staffing agencies began warning applicants before accepting the assignment. "Be prepared," they would say. Nobody lasts. Soon the rumors became even stranger. One caregiver insisted Richard talked to empty corners of the room. Another claimed emergency alarms mysteriously activated in the middle of the night without explanation. Someone else swore they heard Richard speaking to people who weren't there. None of the stories could ever be confirmed. But they spread quickly. Within months, the assignment developed an almost mythical reputation among caregivers. The Hawthorne case. People avoided it whenever possible. Inside the mansion, Richard seemed almost determined to prove every rumor true. He rejected help, refused therapy, ignored conversations, complained about every meal, criticized every nurse, demanded impossible standards. When caregivers tried being cheerful, he called them fake. When they remained professional, he accused them of not caring. No response ever seemed good enough. Eventually, Richard stopped speaking for days at a time. He would simply stare through the window in complete silence. Some believed he had given up. Others believed he wanted everyone else to give up too. Late one evening, the director of the private nursing agency sat across from her exhausted staff. No one volunteered. No one even looked up. "I need someone for the Hawthorne overnight shift," she asked quietly. Silence. A few nurses exchanged nervous glances. One pretended to answer a text message. Another suddenly became interested in paperwork. Finally, someone spoke. "I'm sorry," a veteran nurse whispered. "I can't go back there." The director sighed. 11 caregivers had already left 11, each one convinced the assignment was impossible. She rubbed her temples, wondering how she would explain another staffing failure to one of the richest men in the country. Then the office door slowly opened. A man wearing faded jeans, worn work boots, and an inexpensive brown jacket stepped inside carrying a small backpack. His face looked exhausted, but his eyes were calm. He glanced around the room before speaking politely. "I heard you're looking for someone to work the midnight shift." The room fell completely silent. Several nurses stared at him with disbelief. One quietly muttered, "You have no idea what you're walking into." The man offered a small smile. "My name is Daniel Carter," he said, "and I still need the job." No one in that room could have imagined that this ordinary single father was about to change the life of America's most feared billionaire forever. While Richard Hawthorne's mansion had become a place everyone tried to avoid, across the city another man was fighting a very different battle. His name was Daniel Carter. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have powerful friends. No luxury cars waited in his driveway. Instead, every morning before sunrise, Daniel's day began in a tiny two-bedroom apartment where the paint was peeling from the walls and the heater only worked when it felt like it. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily, was the reason he kept going. Every morning, before heading to school, Lily would wrap her tiny arms around her father and ask the same innocent question. "Daddy, are you coming home tonight?" Daniel always smiled, even when he was exhausted. "I always come home." The smile on his face never revealed how frightened he really was. 3 years earlier, Daniel's wife, Emma, had lost her battle with cancer. In a matter of months, Daniel had gone from being a happy husband to a grieving widower and a full-time single father. The hospital bills had emptied every savings account they owned. The mortgage was gone. The family car had been sold. Even Emma's wedding ring had quietly disappeared one afternoon. Not because Daniel wanted to let it go, but because Lily needed groceries more than memories could buy. Since then, life had become a nonstop race. During the day, Daniel worked as a maintenance technician at a local community center. In the evenings, he delivered food across the city. Whenever he could, he accepted temporary caregiving jobs, despite having only basic medical experience. Every dollar mattered, every hour mattered, because every Friday, another stack of bills arrived: rent, electricity, school supplies, medical insurance. The numbers never stopped growing. Some nights, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel would sit alone at the kitchen table staring at unpaid notices, wondering which bill could wait another week. He almost never cried, not because he wasn't hurting, because he couldn't afford to stop moving. One rainy evening, while scrolling through temporary job listings on his aging phone, a posting caught his attention. Private overnight caregiver. Needed excellent pay. Immediate start. No long-term commitment. Daniel read the salary twice, then a third time. It paid nearly 4 times what he normally earned during a night shift. His first thought wasn't about the money. It was about Lily. With just a few weeks of that income, he could finally replace her broken school laptop. He could catch up on rent, maybe even buy the winter coat she'd quietly pretended she didn't need. Without wasting another second, Daniel submitted his application. The next afternoon, he was sitting inside the offices of a private nursing agency. The woman interviewing him looked unusually nervous. She folded her hands together before speaking. "Mr. Carter, have you ever heard of Richard Hawthorne?" Daniel nodded. "The billionaire?" "Yes." She hesitated. "This position is in his private residence." Daniel's eyes widened. "I wasn't expecting that." The woman forced a weak smile. "Most people aren't." She opened a thick file sitting on her desk. Inside were resignation letters, page after page. She slowly pushed the folder toward Daniel. 11 caregivers have quit this assignment." Daniel looked up. 11? She nodded. Some lasted 2 weeks. Some didn't make it through a single night. Daniel quietly turned another page. Each resignation sounded almost identical. Emotionally exhausting. Impossible patient, hostile environment. Unbearable pressure. The woman leaned forward. "I need to ask you something honestly." Daniel looked at her. "After hearing all this, do you still want the job?" Daniel closed the folder and sat quietly for several seconds. Finally, he looked up and asked a question the interviewer wasn't expecting. "What happened to Mr. Hawthorne before all this?" The woman blinked. "You mean, before the accident?" Daniel nodded. She sighed softly. "He built one of the biggest companies in America. Then everything changed overnight. People say he became impossible after losing the use of his body." Daniel remained silent. The interviewer continued. "He insults people. He refuses help. He pushes everyone away. Honestly, I don't think he's trying to recover anymore." She paused before adding, "I've seen experienced nurses leave his mansion in tears." Daniel gently slid the folder back across the desk. "People usually act difficult because they're hurting." The woman stared at him. "You still don't understand." "No," Daniel replied calmly. "Maybe I understand more than you think." She raised an eyebrow. "My wife spent nearly a year in hospitals before she passed away." For the first time during the interview, the room became completely quiet. Daniel continued in a soft voice. "I watched fear change her. Some days she smiled. Other days she pushed everyone away, even me." He looked toward the window. "Pain makes people say things they don't really mean." The interviewer slowly lowered her eyes. "You really believe that's what's happening with Richard?" Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. But I know one thing. No one wakes up hoping to become the person everyone fears." Several moments passed before the woman finally stood. "If you're certain." "I am." She handed him a visitor badge and a set of documents. "Your shift starts tonight." Just before midnight, Daniel parked his old pickup truck outside Hawthorne Estate. The mansion looked more like a luxury resort than a home. Tall iron gates, private security, perfectly trimmed gardens, massive stone fountains. Everything reflected wealth, everything except the silence. As Daniel walked toward the entrance carrying his small backpack, he noticed something strange. The house felt empty, not peaceful empty. Inside, a senior nurse greeted him. "You must be Daniel." He smiled politely. "That's me." She gave him a quick tour of the medical wing. "This is the monitoring station." She pointed toward another room. "Medication cabinet." Then another. "Emergency equipment." Finally, they stopped outside a large wooden door. She lowered her voice. "He's inside." Daniel noticed she didn't immediately open it. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes. "If he tells you to leave, don't argue. If he insults you, don't take it personally. If he throws something," Daniel smiled slightly, "I'll duck." For the first time all night, the nurse laughed. "You're either very brave or completely crazy." She quietly knocked. No answer. She opened the door anyway. Richard Hawthorne sat in a motorized wheelchair near the enormous bedroom window. Moonlight spilled across the polished wooden floor. He never turned around. His eyes remained fixed on the city lights in the distance. The nurse cleared her throat. Mr. Hawthorne, your new overnight caregiver is here. Without moving, Richard spoke. His voice was cold. Number 12. The nurse hesitated. Sir, that's what he is. My 12th mistake. Daniel stepped forward. Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne. Richard slowly turned his chair. His sharp blue eyes studied Daniel from head to toe. The worn boots, the inexpensive jacket, the backpack with a faded zipper. He looked nothing like the highly trained private caregivers Richard usually hired. A faint smirk crossed Richard's face. They're sending maintenance workers now? Daniel simply smiled. No. I'm here to take care of you. Richard laughed bitterly. No. You're here for the paycheck. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he quietly placed his backpack in the corner. He checked the medication schedule, adjusted a curtain that had been left partially open, straightened a blanket that had slipped onto the floor. Without saying another word, he picked up a trash bag beside the bed and emptied it. Richard watched every movement, waiting, expecting the usual nervous chatter, the forced optimism, the fake sympathy. Instead, Daniel worked in complete silence. After several minutes, Richard finally snapped. Aren't you going to ask me how I'm feeling? Daniel continued, organizing the bedside table. If you wanted to tell me, you already would have. Richard frowned. Most caregivers filled every second with conversation. Daniel seemed perfectly comfortable with silence. Another minute passed. Richard tried again. You know you'll quit. Daniel calmly wiped down the bedside tray. Maybe. Richard looked surprised. Maybe? Daniel nodded. If I stop doing my best, then I should quit. But I haven't started yet. For the first time in months, Richard didn't know what to say. He had insulted him, questioned his motives, tried to provoke him. Nothing worked. As Daniel quietly finished organizing the room, Richard continued watching him with growing curiosity. This man wasn't behaving like the others. He wasn't trying to impress him. He wasn't afraid of him. And somehow, that bothered Richard more than any argument ever had. Outside the bedroom, the senior nurse glanced through the partially open door. She expected shouting. Instead, she found complete silence. Daniel calmly working, Richard silently watching. She whispered to another nurse, I've never seen him this quiet. Inside the room, Richard kept staring at the ordinary single father who had walked into his life just after midnight. For the first time since the accident, Richard Hawthorne couldn't figure someone out. The first week passed in complete silence. Every night, Daniel arrived at exactly 11:45 p.m. Every morning, he left just before sunrise. Richard never thanked him, never smiled, never asked a single question. Yet Daniel showed up every night as though none of it mattered. Unlike the previous caregivers, he never forced conversation. He never said things like, everything will be okay. He never treated Richard like a helpless patient. Instead, he treated him like a person. If Richard wanted silence, Daniel respected it. If Richard needed assistance, Daniel helped without making it feel like pity. Night after night, the routine became almost predictable. Daniel checked the medication schedule, adjusted Richard's position to prevent pressure sores, prepared warm tea that Richard rarely drank, reviewed the medical monitors. Then he quietly sat in the chair across the room, reading a worn paperback novel. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. For the first time since the accident, Richard found himself no longer counting the minutes until a caregiver left the room. One evening, just after midnight, Daniel looked at his phone and smiled. Richard noticed immediately. What? He asked coldly. Daniel looked up. My daughter. Richard rolled his eyes. Let me guess. Another picture? Daniel chuckled. Actually, he turned the phone around. Lily decided to cut her own hair. Richard glanced at the screen. The little girl had uneven bangs, a huge missing patch near one ear, and the biggest smile imaginable. Daniel laughed. She told me she wanted to look like a movie star. For several seconds, Richard simply stared. Daniel continued smiling. I spent an hour trying not to laugh while fixing it. Richard looked away. I don't see what's funny. Daniel shrugged. Maybe you had to be there. The room became quiet again. But something had changed. The next night, Daniel arrived carrying a small paper bag. Richard looked suspicious. "What's that?" "My dinner." "You eat that every night?" Daniel opened the bag. A simple peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. Richard frowned. "That's all?" Daniel nodded casually. "It gets the job done." Richard didn't say anything. But after Daniel walked into the hallway for supplies, Richard noticed something unusual. The sandwich remained untouched. Later that night, Daniel quietly wrapped it back inside the paper bag. Richard finally asked, "Why didn't you eat?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Lily forgot her lunch this morning. I gave her mine." Richard stared at him. "So, you've eaten nothing?" Daniel smiled. "I'll survive." He changed the subject immediately, as though it wasn't important. To Richard, it was. For years, he had been surrounded by executives who negotiated million-dollar bonuses. People who demanded more, wanted more, expected more. Yet this exhausted single father had quietly skipped dinner without mentioning it. Not for attention, not for sympathy. Simply because his daughter came first. That thought stayed with Richard long after Daniel finished his shift. The following night, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the mansion. Daniel rushed into Richard's room. A framed photograph had fallen from a shelf. The glass had shattered across the floor. Daniel immediately began cleaning it. Richard watched silently. When Daniel picked up the damaged photograph, he paused. It showed a much younger Richard standing beside a smiling woman and a little boy. Daniel carefully brushed the broken glass away. "Your family?" Richard's expression changed instantly. "Leave it." Daniel nodded. "I'm sorry." He gently placed the photograph on the bedside table and continued cleaning without asking another question. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Then, without looking away from the window, Richard quietly said, "My son was 8. Daniel froze. It was the first personal sentence Richard had spoken since they met. Daniel slowly looked up from the broken frame. He hadn't expected Richard to continue. But after several long seconds, the billionaire spoke again. "My son was 8 years old when his mother left." His voice was flat, almost emotionless. Yet beneath every word was a weight that had clearly been carried for years. Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "She couldn't stand the hours I worked." Richard's eyes remained fixed on the rain outside the window. "I kept telling myself I was building a better future for them." A bitter smile crossed his face. "By the time I realized they wanted my time instead of my money, it was too late." Daniel quietly placed the repaired photograph on the bedside table. "I'm sorry." Richard shook his head. "Don't be. I made my choices." Another silence settled over the room. But this silence felt different. It no longer felt like a wall. It felt like trust slowly finding its way into the room. The nights continued to pass. Sometimes Daniel spoke. Sometimes Richard did. Often neither of them said a word for an hour. Oddly enough, those became Richard's favorite nights. Daniel never pressured him to open up. Instead, he filled the quiet with simple stories about ordinary life. He talked about Lily learning to ride a bicycle, about burning pancakes because he was trying to answer a work call, about pretending to know how to braid hair by watching online tutorials. "I accidentally tied a ribbon into her ponytail backwards," Daniel admitted one night. Lily looked in the mirror and said, "Daddy, I look like a confused unicorn." For a brief moment, Richard laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It escaped before he could stop it. Daniel heard it, but he pretended not to. He simply continued organizing the medicine tray as though nothing had happened. Richard noticed. Most people would have pointed it out. "You smiled. You laughed." Daniel didn't. That simple act of pretending not to notice somehow made Richard feel safe. A few nights later, Richard finally asked the first question he had ever asked Daniel. "How old is your daughter?" Daniel looked pleasantly surprised. 6. Richard nodded slowly. "Does she remember her mother?" Daniel's smile faded. "A little, mostly through pictures." He reached into his wallet and removed a small photograph. Lily stood between her parents in a sunflower field, Laughing with both hands stretched toward the camera, Daniel looked at it for a moment before putting it away. I tell her stories every night. I don't want her to forget. Richard quietly stared at the ceiling. I barely remember my father's voice. Daniel didn't know how to answer. Neither man spoke for several minutes. One evening, Daniel's phone vibrated repeatedly. He stepped into the hallway to answer. Richard wasn't trying to listen, but the raised voices carried through the open doorway. I'm trying, Daniel said quietly. I know the rent is late, please. I just need another week. A pause. I understand. Another pause. No, please don't do that. His voice cracked. My daughter is asleep. Richard had never heard Daniel sound frightened before. Several minutes later, Daniel returned. His smile was back. Artificial, but back. Everything okay? Richard asked. Daniel nodded immediately. Just paperwork. Richard knew he was lying. He also knew Daniel wasn't lying to protect himself. He was protecting his dignity. That realization stayed with Richard long after sunrise. Over the following week, Richard began noticing things he had ignored before. Daniel always arrived wearing the same worn boots. The soles were separating. His jacket sleeve had been stitched by hand. His phone screen was cracked. He drove an aging pickup truck that coughed every time the engine started, yet despite everything, Daniel was never late, never complained, never asked Richard for favors, never mentioned money. One morning, after Daniel finished helping him with breakfast, Richard finally asked, "Why are you still here?" Daniel looked confused. "You've had easier jobs, better paying jobs. You know I'll probably never walk again." Daniel simply shrugged. "My wife once told me something." Richard waited. She said, "The easiest people to love are the ones who don't need it." He smiled softly. "The people who push everyone away usually need it the most." Richard looked down at his motionless hands. For the first time since the accident, he couldn't think of a sarcastic reply. That night, after Daniel's shift ended, Richard remained awake for hours. He replayed every conversation in his mind, every story about Lily, every quiet act of kindness. Every moment Daniel had chosen patience instead of frustration. Something inside Richard was changing, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, but changing nonetheless. And before dawn broke over the city, Richard made a decision no billionaire had ever imagined he would make. He reached for the intercom. "Tomorrow night," he whispered. "Tell Daniel I'd like him to stay a little longer." By the beginning of Daniel's third week, the mansion no longer felt like a workplace. It felt like a puzzle. At first, the changes were almost too small to notice. A medication bottle that had been nearly full one night was suddenly half empty the next morning. A medical chart Daniel had carefully updated disappeared before sunrise. The security monitor outside Richard's room occasionally went black for several minutes before turning back on without explanation. Each incident could have been an accident, but together, they formed a pattern. Daniel had spent years fixing broken machinery. He knew the difference between coincidence and repetition. Something wasn't right. One evening, while preparing Richard's medication, Daniel frowned. "Mr. Hawthorne." Richard looked up from the window. "What? Did your doctor change your prescription?" "No." Daniel held up the bottle. "The dosage label is different." Richard narrowed his eyes. "It shouldn't be." Daniel checked yesterday's nursing notes. They showed the original dosage. Someone had replaced the label. Quietly, without recording the change, Daniel immediately contacted the on-call physician. 20 minutes later, the doctor arrived looking confused. "I never authorized this." He removed the bottle from Daniel's hand. "Where did this come from?" "It was already in the cabinet," Daniel answered. The doctor became visibly concerned. This medication at this dosage could seriously harm him. The room fell silent. Richard slowly turned toward Daniel. "If you hadn't noticed." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Both men understood what almost happened. The following night, Daniel began paying closer attention. Instead of assuming everything was correct, he verified every medication, every signature, every report, every machine. The more he checked, the more irregularities he found. A wheelchair maintenance report had been forged. Medical supplies ordered but never delivered. Invoices signed by employees who had already resigned. Someone had been changing records for months, perhaps longer. Daniel quietly photographed everything with his phone. He told no one, not even Richard. 3 nights later, another strange event occurred. Just after 2 a.m., every security camera in the medical wing suddenly lost signal. The hallway monitors went completely black. Emergency backup systems should have activated instantly. They didn't. Daniel walked into the corridor. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. As he checked the control panel, he heard soft footsteps. Someone rounded the corner. A man wearing a dark business suit. Not hospital staff, not security. The stranger froze for half a second after seeing Daniel, then smiled politely. "Working late?" Daniel nodded. "So are you." The man adjusted his tie. "I was just checking on Mr. Hawthorne." Daniel had never seen him before. "Which department?" The man's smile faded for the briefest moment. "Executive administration." Without another word, he walked away. Daniel watched until he disappeared down the hallway. Something about the encounter felt wrong, very wrong. The next evening, Daniel mentioned the incident to Richard. "The man in the hallway," Richard interrupted immediately. "What did he look like?" Daniel described him. "Gray suit, silver watch, black leather briefcase." Richard's face lost all color. "That's Victor Lang, my chief financial officer." Daniel frowned. "He said he was checking on you." Richard laughed bitterly. "Victor hasn't visited me in over 3 months." The room became completely silent. Daniel slowly asked, "Then why was he here?" Richard stared at the ceiling for several seconds before answering. "Because someone inside this house doesn't want me getting better." Daniel looked at him in disbelief. Richard lowered his voice. "The accident wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning." Daniel stood motionless. He searched Richard's face for any sign that this was paranoia caused by months of isolation. Instead, he found something else: fear. It was the first time Daniel had ever seen fear in the man who once intimidated Fortune 500 executives with a single look. Richard slowly took a deep breath. "You remember the 11 caregivers?" Daniel nodded. "I've been wondering about them." Richard looked toward the closed bedroom door before lowering his voice. "They didn't all quit," Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "The first 3 resigned because they couldn't stand me. I'll admit that. I pushed everyone away. I wanted to be left alone." He paused. "But the others, they changed." Daniel listened carefully. "One nurse suddenly stopped speaking to me. Another kept looking over her shoulder every few minutes. One caregiver walked into my room crying. When I asked what happened, she only said, 'I'm sorry, Mr. Hawthorne.' And she never came back." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Richard continued. "I later tried contacting 2 of them. They refused to answer. One even changed her phone number." Daniel slowly sat down. "That's not normal." "It isn't." For the next several nights, Daniel quietly continued gathering information. He never searched openly. He simply observed. He noticed Victor Lang visiting the administrative office after midnight. He noticed confidential company files being delivered to the mansion instead of corporate headquarters. He noticed security guards changing shifts without recording their names. The deeper he looked, the more disturbing the picture became. One night, while organizing storage cabinets, Daniel found an old cardboard box marked former staff records. Most of the files were ordinary: employment forms, schedules, performance reviews. Then one folder caught his attention. It belonged to a caregiver named Melissa Turner. According to official records, she had resigned voluntarily. Inside the folder, however, was a handwritten note folded between 2 pages. Daniel carefully unfolded it. It contained only one sentence: "If anything happens to me, don't believe them." No signature, no explanation. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. He slipped the note into his pocket just as footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone was coming. He quietly closed the box and walked away before anyone noticed. Later that night, Daniel showed the note to Richard. Richard read it twice. His hands couldn't shake anymore. But his eyes did. "I knew it," he whispered. "I knew I wasn't imagining this." Daniel looked directly at him. "Tell me everything." Richard closed his eyes. 6 months before my accident, I changed my will." Daniel remained silent. "I also planned to remove several executives from the company. Victor was one of them." Daniel's eyebrows lifted. "Why?" "I discovered millions of dollars disappearing through fake consulting contracts. I confronted no one. I wanted proof first." He looked toward the city lights. "Then, the accident happened." Daniel finished the sentence for him. "And once you couldn't run the company, they could." Richard nodded. "The board appointed Victor as acting chief executive. He now controls nearly every decision." Daniel's stomach tightened. "So if you never recover," Richard looked at him, "everything I built becomes theirs." Neither man noticed the hallway door opening slightly. Outside, someone was listening. A polished black shoe remained perfectly still beneath the crack in the doorway. The conversation inside continued. Daniel leaned closer. "We need evidence." Richard gave a weak smile. "You sound like a detective." "I'm a father," Daniel replied quietly. "When something threatens my family, I don't stop until I understand it." Richard looked at him for a long moment. Then he whispered something he never imagined saying. "I trust you." The words surprised both of them. For months, Richard had trusted no one. Now he was placing his future in the hands of a man he had met only weeks earlier. The next evening, Daniel stayed after his shift officially ended. Using his maintenance access card, he entered areas most caregivers never visited: mechanical rooms, star drawer offices, security control panels. Inside one locked cabinet, he discovered backup surveillance hard drives. Most were labeled by date. One drive was missing. Its slot was empty. Someone had removed it. As Daniel closed the cabinet, he noticed fresh fingerprints on the dust-covered shelf. Someone else had searched there recently. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Daniel quietly took photographs before leaving. He didn't notice the tiny security camera hidden above the ceiling vent. Elsewhere in the mansion, a computer monitor flickered to life. Victor Lang watched every movement in silence. He picked up his phone. "We have a problem," he said calmly. "The new caregiver is asking too many questions." There was a pause. Then the voice on the other end asked, "What do you want us to do?" Victor's expression never changed. "Nothing. Not yet. I want to know everything about Daniel Carter." He looked back at the surveillance screen. "And if he gets any closer to the truth," his voice became cold, "make sure he regrets it." Hours later, Daniel finished his shift and walked toward the employee parking lot beneath the dim glow of the streetlights. The lot was almost empty. His old pickup truck sat alone near the far fence. As he reached for the driver's door, he noticed another vehicle parked directly behind it. A black SUV, its headlights suddenly switched on. The driver's door slowly opened. Someone stepped out waiting. Watching, Daniel instinctively froze. He realized with a sinking feeling that whoever had been hiding in the shadows now knew exactly who he was. Daniel's heart pounded as the driver of the black SUV stepped into the light. It wasn't Victor Lang. It was another man, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit. He closed the SUV door gently, as though he had all the time in the world. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. The stranger smiled politely. "My name is Thomas Reed. I work for people who appreciate loyalty." Daniel's expression remained calm. "I don't know you. You don't have to." Thomas took a slow step forward. "We've been watching you." Daniel's stomach tightened. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." Thomas chuckled. "No, we know exactly who you are." He reached into his jacket and removed a thick white envelope. Without opening it, Daniel already knew what it contained. Money, a lot of it. Thomas held it out. $100,000. Daniel stared at the envelope. Cash. No taxes. No questions. Walk away from Richard Hawthorne. Daniel didn't move, Thomas continued. You resign tomorrow. You never return. You forget everything you've seen. Daniel finally spoke. And if I don't? Thomas's smile disappeared. I'd hate for life to become difficult. He glanced toward Daniel's aging pickup truck. You have a beautiful daughter. Daniel's entire body became rigid. Thomas noticed the reaction. We know where she goes to school. We know which park she likes. We know what time you pick her up every afternoon. Silence. Daniel slowly stepped closer. His voice became almost a whisper. If you're threatening my child, Thomas interrupted calmly. I'm making sure you understand the consequences of making the wrong decision. He placed the envelope on the hood of the pickup. Think about it. Then he climbed back into the SUV. Within seconds, the vehicle disappeared into the darkness. Daniel remained standing alone in the empty parking lot. He looked at the envelope, then at the road where the SUV had vanished. Finally, he picked up the envelope, walked to the nearest trash bin, and dropped every dollar into it. The following morning, Daniel barely slept. For the first time since Emma's death, fear wasn't for himself, it was for Lily. When she ran into the kitchen, smiling with her backpack, Daniel hugged her tighter than usual. Daddy? She laughed. I can't breathe. He smiled and let go. Sorry, you just surprised me. She looked up at him. Everything okay? Daniel forced a smile. Everything's perfect. Children often notice things adults miss. Lily tilted her head. You're pretending again. Daniel froze. What do you mean? You smile like that when you're worried. He gently brushed her hair away from her face. I'll always keep you safe. She smiled. I know. Those 3 words somehow made the promise feel even heavier. That night, Daniel arrived at the mansion looking more tired than Richard had ever seen him. Richard noticed immediately. You didn't sleep. Daniel shrugged. Busy day. Richard stared at him. You've been threatened. Daniel looked up sharply. How did you know? Richard gave a bitter laugh. Because they used the same method on everyone else. Daniel slowly sat beside the window. They know about Lily. Richard closed his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with guilt. You need to leave. Daniel looked at him. I'm serious. They'll destroy anyone who stays close to me. I've already lost enough people. I'm not losing another. Daniel remained silent. Richard continued. My company, my fortune, it isn't worth your daughter's life. Daniel looked toward the city lights, then quietly answered. This stopped being about your company a long time ago. He turned back toward Richard. It's about doing what's right. For the first time in years, Richard felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. Richard didn't sleep that day. For hours, he stared at the ceiling, replaying every decision that had brought him here. He had spent decades believing that success meant winning every negotiation, every acquisition, every battle. Yet the greatest act of courage he had ever witnessed wasn't performed in a boardroom. It was performed by a single father who refused to abandon someone who could no longer offer him anything in return. As sunset faded beyond the mansion windows, Richard made another decision. Open the safe, he said quietly. Daniel looked confused. What safe? Richard nodded toward a painting hanging across the room. Behind that, Daniel moved the painting aside, revealing a hidden biometric lock. Richard gave him the access code. After a soft click, the steel door slowly swung open. Inside were stacks of legal documents, encrypted hard drives, company seals, and several sealed envelopes. Richard pointed toward a black folder. Take it. Daniel opened it carefully. His eyes widened. Barred meeting transcripts, bank transfers, tenal emails, signed financial authorizations. Every page pointed to the same person, Victor Lang. For months, Richard had secretly collected evidence, planning to expose the fraud before the accident changed everything. I never had enough proof to go public, Richard admitted. But together with what you've found, it's enough. Daniel carefully closed the folder. So why didn't you give this to the police? Richard looked away. Because I didn't know who I could trust. The next afternoon, Daniel met with the only person Richard still believed in, His longtime corporate attorney, Margaret Ellis. She had worked beside Richard for nearly 25 years. When Daniel placed the folder on her desk, she opened it in silence, the color drained from her face. "I thought these files were destroyed." Richard had hidden duplicates without telling anyone. Margaret looked at Daniel. "Do you realize what you're holding?" Daniel nodded. "Evidence." She shook her head. "No. This is the reason people have been trying to keep Richard silent." She immediately locked the office door and picked up her phone. "We don't have much time." Within the hour, a confidential meeting was arranged with federal investigators and financial crime specialists. Every document was copied, every hard drive secured. Every photograph Daniel had taken inside the mansion was added to the evidence. For the first time since the accident, the truth was no longer hidden inside one room. It had left the mansion. Back at Hawthorne Estate, Victor Lang sat in the executive office reviewing quarterly reports when his private phone rang. He listened for less than 30 seconds. His expression hardened. "They've contacted Ellis?" A long pause. "How much do they know?" Another pause. Victor slowly stood. "Find Daniel Carter. I don't care where he is. Bring me everything." He ended the call and looked through the office window toward Richard's medical wing. His carefully built empire was beginning to crack. That evening, Daniel returned to the mansion as usual. He refused to let fear change his routine. Richard immediately noticed the determined look on his face. "You met Margaret," Daniel smiled. "She's already moving." Richard let out a slow breath. "Then maybe we still have a chance." Before Daniel could answer, alarms suddenly echoed throughout the estate. Emergency lights flashed across the hallways. Red warning lights illuminated every corridor. "What happened?" Daniel asked. The head nurse rushed into the room. "The security system has been overridden. Every electronic lock in the building just activated." Daniel immediately rolled Richard's wheelchair toward the door. The hallway was in complete chaos. Security guards shouted over their radios. Staff members hurried in every direction. Then, the mansion went completely dark. Every light disappeared. Only emergency exit signs glowed faintly in the silence. For several terrifying seconds, no one moved. Then footsteps echoed through the darkness. Slow, deliberate. Getting closer, Daniel positioned himself between Richard and the hallway. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness. One, then another, then four more. Several figures emerged from the shadows wearing black tactical clothing. None displayed company badges. None identified themselves. The leader spoke calmly. "Mr. Carter, this doesn't have to end badly." Daniel didn't move. Richard whispered, "Run." Daniel shook his head. "Not without you." The men continued advancing. One reached into his jacket. Daniel instinctively grabbed the heavy metal IV stand beside him. His heart pounded as he prepared for whatever came next. Then, from outside the mansion, the piercing sound of multiple police sirens shattered the silence. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows. Voices shouted across the front entrance. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" The tactical team froze. For the first time, uncertainty crossed their faces. Daniel looked toward Richard. Richard smiled faintly. The truth finally caught up with them. But even as relief began to settle in, Victor Lang was nowhere to be found. His office upstairs was empty, his phone had been switched off, and the man behind the conspiracy had vanished into the night. The mansion buzzed with flashing lights and urgent voices. Federal agents secured every entrance. Medical staff hurried through the hallways while investigators collected computers, financial records, and surveillance equipment. Victor Lang had escaped, but his empire had not. By sunrise, the news had spread across the country. America's most respected business empire had become the center of one of the largest corporate fraud investigations in years. Television networks covered the story nonstop. Newspapers revealed millions of dollars in stolen company funds. Former employees began coming forward with stories they had been too afraid to tell before. One by one, the truth surfaced, and with every new revelation, Daniel realized something. The handwritten note left behind by caregiver Melissa had been right all along. No one had believed them. Until now, several weeks passed. Victor Lang was finally captured while attempting to leave the country using false identification. Other executives involved in the conspiracy were arrested. Soon after, the board of directors voted unanimously to remove every executive connected to the fraud. For the first time since the accident, Richard Hawthorne truly felt free, not because he had regained his company, but because he no longer carried the burden alone. Richard's rehabilitation also began to change. His doctors noticed something remarkable. His blood pressure stabilized, his appetite returned. His determination grew stronger every week. One afternoon, during a physical therapy session, his therapist asked him to attempt something he had failed dozens of times before. Push. Richard closed his eyes. Every muscle strained. Nothing happened then. The smallest movement, a finger, barely noticeable. The therapist froze. Again. Richard concentrated harder. His index finger twitched a second time. The room erupted with excitement. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a full recovery. But after months of absolutely no movement, it was hope. Daniel was the first person Richard wanted to tell. That evening, when Daniel arrived for work, Richard lifted his hand as much as he could. "You see that?" Daniel smiled instantly. "I do. You moved." Richard laughed softly. "I've never been happier over something so small." Daniel pulled up a chair beside him. "Small victories become big ones." Richard looked at him thoughtfully. "You've said that before." Daniel nodded. "My wife used to say it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard spoke again. "Emma must have been an incredible woman." Daniel smiled. "She was. She believed kindness always comes back." Richard looked out the window. "I spent most of my life believing power changed people." He looked back at Daniel. "I was wrong. Kindness does." A few days later, Richard asked his attorney, Margaret Ellis, to arrange one final board meeting. Not to discuss profits, not to discuss acquisitions, but to announce something no one expected. Every director gathered around the long conference table. Many had not seen Richard in person since the accident. As he entered the room in his wheelchair, the entire board stood in silence. Richard looked around slowly, then smiled. "I have one final decision to make." No one interrupted. He opened a folder resting on his lap. "The greatest investment I ever made was never one of my companies." He paused. It was believing in the right person. Every member of the board remained silent. For years, they had expected Richard Hawthorne to speak about quarterly profits, acquisitions, or shareholder value. Instead, he slowly closed the folder and looked toward the back of the room. "Daniel." A confused murmur spread across the table. Daniel, who had only come to accompany Richard to the meeting, hesitated. Richard smiled. "Come here." Embarrassed by the attention, Daniel walked toward the front of the room. He was still wearing the same modest suit he had worn to job interviews months earlier, still carrying himself like an ordinary man. Richard waited until he stood beside him. Then he turned to the directors. "When I lost the use of my legs, I believed I had lost everything. My company, my future, my purpose." He paused before continuing. "But I was wrong. What I had really lost was my ability to trust." The room remained completely still. Richard looked at Daniel. This man had every reason to walk away. He was underpaid. He was threatened. He was offered more money than most people earn in years. He was told his daughter could be in danger. And yet, he stayed. Not because he expected anything in return, but because he believed helping another human being was simply the right thing to do. Richard's voice grew quieter. "I built an empire by recognizing talent, but I almost missed the greatest character I have ever known." Several directors lowered their eyes. For the first time, they understood that this meeting had nothing to do with business. It was about gratitude. Richard picked up the final envelope resting inside the folder. "I recently updated my will." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, you don't have to." Richard smiled. "I'm not finished. He handed the envelope to Daniel. Inside was a single document. Daniel read the first page. His eyes widened. Richard had created a charitable foundation funded with hundreds of millions of dollars. Its purpose was simple: to provide free, high-quality, in-home medical care for patients whose families could never afford it. Caregivers would receive fair wages. Single parents would receive child care support while working. Families struggling with medical bills would receive assistance without endless paperwork. At the bottom of the document was one final line: Founding Executive Director, Daniel Carter. Daniel looked up in disbelief. "I can't run something like this." Richard smiled. "You already have. You built it the night you walked into my room. The paperwork is simply catching up." Daniel felt tears filling his eyes. "I only did my job." Richard gently shook his head. "No. You reminded me what being human looks like." Months later, Hawthorne Care Foundation opened its first rehabilitation center. Families traveled from across the country. Some came with injured parents, some with disabled children. Others simply needed hope after years of feeling forgotten. Above the entrance hung a bronze plaque. It didn't carry Richard Hawthorne's name. Instead, it read, "Real wealth is measured by the lives you lift, not the fortune you keep." Visitors often stopped to read it before walking inside. Few knew the story behind those words. But everyone who entered felt their meaning. On a warm spring afternoon, Daniel stood outside Lily's elementary school waiting for dismissal. Children ran through the front gates laughing. A familiar little voice called out, "Daddy?" Lily sprinted across the sidewalk and threw her arms around him. He laughed as he lifted her into the air. "How was school?" "The best." She held up a drawing. It showed three people: Daniel, Lily, and Richard sitting in his wheelchair beneath a bright blue sky. Above them she had written in careful, uneven letters, "Heroes don't always wear capes. They sometimes stay." Daniel smiled, fighting back tears. He folded the picture carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "It'll stay with me forever." Across town, Richard sat in the rehabilitation garden of the foundation that now carried a new purpose. His recovery was slow. He still relied on his wheelchair. But every week brought another small improvement, another finger movement, another stronger grip, another reason to keep trying. Daniel joined him on a nearby bench. Neither man spoke for several minutes. They simply watched families walking through the gardens together. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "You know, I used to think success meant leaving behind skyscrapers with my name on them." He smiled as children laughed in the distance. "I was wrong." Daniel looked at him. "What changed your mind?" Richard glanced toward the foundation entrance, where nurses welcomed another family through the doors. "You did." He paused. "Buildings eventually crumble. Companies change hands. Money disappears. But one act of kindness can echo through generations." Daniel nodded quietly. Neither man needed to say another word, because both understood the truth. The greatest inheritance Richard Hawthorne would ever leave behind wasn't the company he built. It wasn't the fortune he earned. It was the life he chose to change. And the ordinary single father who walked through his door just after midnight, expecting only a job, but leaving behind a legacy that no amount of money could ever buy. The end.